The sun had long dipped below the horizon, leaving Brookfield cloaked in the dim glow of streetlights. The city was alive with its usual nighttime hum, cars rolling past, distant laughter from a nearby bar, and the occasional bark of a dog echoing through the quiet streets. It was a typical evening for Officer Daniel Hayes, who sat behind the wheel of his patrol car, sipping stale coffee from a paper cup. His shift was halfway done, but he felt no sense of relief. Instead, irritation simmered beneath his skin like a low-grade fever. Daniel wasn't known for being friendly or approachable. He carried himself with an air of superiority, always quick to judge and slow to listen. His reputation around the precinct was well established. He was tough, blunt, and unapologetically opinionated. Some admired his dedication, others avoided him whenever possible. But one thing was certain. Daniel believed he knew how things worked in Brookfield, and he didn't hesitate to act on those beliefs. As he drove down Elm Street, his eyes landed on someone sitting alone on a park bench near the edge of the small green space. At first glance, it seemed harmless enough, a person enjoying the cool night air. But something about the figure caught his attention. It was a woman, her silhouette illuminated faintly by the lamppost above her. She appeared calm, almost regal, as she sat upright with her hands resting gently on her lap. What stood out most to Daniel was her race. She was black. Without giving it much thought, Daniel pulled over to the curb and stepped out of his car. His boots clicked against the pavement. As he approached her, his expression already hardened into a scowl. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice sharp and authoritative. "What are you doing here?" The woman turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze with steady eyes. Her face revealed no trace of fear or intimidation, only mild curiosity. "I'm just sitting," she replied simply. Her tone was polite but firm, carrying an undercurrent of confidence that made Daniel bristle. "This area closes after dark," he said, folding his arms across his chest. Technically, this wasn't true. The park didn't have strict hours. But Daniel often used such excuses when he wanted to assert control. "You need to leave." The woman raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed by his attempt at authority. "Really? I've been coming here for years and I've never seen any sign saying it closes at night." Her voice remained calm, though there was a subtle edge to it now. "Are you sure you're not mistaken?" Daniel clenched his jaw, annoyed that she dared to question him. "Look, ma'am, I don't have time for this. Just pack up whatever you're doing and go home." He took a step closer, towering over her seated form. "We get complaints about people hanging around here late at night. You wouldn't want to cause trouble, would you?" For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension between them hung thick in the air, broken only by the distant sound of tires rolling over asphalt. Then, slowly, the woman stood up. She wasn't particularly tall, but her presence commanded respect. She straightened her coat and looked directly at Daniel, her gaze unwavering. "Officer," she began, her voice steady and measured, "I am not causing trouble. I am simply sitting on a public bench in a public park. If anyone is causing trouble here tonight, I'd say it's you." Daniel blinked, momentarily taken aback by her boldness. No one talked back to him like that, not in his experience anyway. Most people either cowered or stormed off in frustration. But this woman, she wasn't afraid of him. And that infuriated him even more. "You think you're clever, huh?" he snapped, leaning in slightly. "Do you know how many problems we deal with because of people like you?" Her eyebrows shot up. "People like me?" she repeated, her tone icy. "And what exactly does that mean?" Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, another voice cut through the tension. "Everything okay here?" A second officer had arrived, drawn by the commotion. Officer Ryan Peterson jogged toward them, his flashlight beam bouncing along the ground. He glanced between Daniel and the woman, sensing the unease radiating from both parties. "Yeah, everything's fine," Daniel muttered, shooting the woman a final glare. "Just making sure everyone follows the rules." The woman crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. "I'll be going now," she said evenly, brushing past Daniel without another word. As she walked away, Her footsteps echoed softly against the pavement, leaving Daniel fuming where he stood. Ryan watched her disappear into the shadows before turning to Daniel. "What was all that about?" he asked cautiously. Daniel waved a hand dismissively. "Nothing, just some troublemaker trying to act smart." He didn't elaborate further, instead climbing back into his patrol car and slamming the door shut. But as he drove off, he couldn't shake the feeling that the encounter had left a mark on him, one he wasn't ready to acknowledge. Unbeknownst to Daniel, the woman he had confronted was far from ordinary. Her name was Michelle Carter, and within days she would walk into the precinct not as a citizen, but as the new chief of police. Little did Daniel know, their paths were destined to cross again, and this time the stakes would be much higher. The precinct buzzed with a mix of anticipation and unease. Word had spread quickly about the arrival of a new chief, someone sent from out of town to take charge of Brookfield PD. For some officers, the news brought excitement, a chance for fresh ideas and leadership that might finally address the growing tensions between the department and the community. Others, however, were skeptical. They muttered under their breath during coffee breaks or exchanged wary glances in the hallways. Change wasn't something they welcomed easily. Officer Daniel Hayes fell squarely into the latter group. He sat at his desk, scowling as he scrolled through emails on his outdated computer. The message from headquarters was brief but clear. "Chief, Michelle Carter would be arriving within the week." Just reading her name made his lip curl. "Carter," he muttered to himself, shaking his head. "What kind of name is that for a police chief?" His grumbling caught the attention of Officer Ryan Peterson, who leaned over from his neighboring desk. "You got a problem with the new boss already?" Ryan asked, raising an eyebrow. Unlike Daniel, Ryan seemed cautiously optimistic about the change. He'd heard rumors that Chief Carter came highly recommended, with years of experience turning around struggling departments in other cities. "Yeah, I've got a problem," Daniel snapped, leaning back in his chair. "They're bringing in some outsider to tell us how to do our jobs. Like we don't know what's best for Brookfield." His voice carried enough volume to draw curious stares from nearby colleagues, but he didn't care. "And besides, did you hear she's, you know?" He trailed off, lowering his voice slightly despite his earlier bravado. "She's black." Ryan frowned, crossing his arms. "So what if she is? That doesn't mean anything." "It means plenty," Daniel shot back, jabbing a finger at his screen. "How's she supposed to understand what it's like out here? She'll probably spend all her time worrying about community relations and handing out hugs instead of cracking down on crime." Ryan sighed, knowing better than to argue further. Daniel's views weren't exactly a secret, and trying to change his mind felt like beating your head against a brick wall. Still, he couldn't help but feel uneasy. If Daniel kept talking like this once Chief Carter arrived, it wouldn't end well for anyone. Meanwhile, across town, Michelle Carter was preparing for her first day in Brookfield. She stood in front of a mirror in her hotel room, adjusting the lapels of her navy blue blazer. Her dark hair was neatly styled and her makeup was subtle, yet professional. She exuded confidence, though anyone paying close attention might have noticed the faint lines of exhaustion around her eyes. Moving to a new city wasn't easy, especially when stepping into such a high-pressure role. Michelle glanced at the stack of folders on the small table beside her bed. Each one contained reports, statistics, and profiles detailing the inner workings of Brookfield PD. She'd spent hours poring over them, searching for patterns and areas where improvements could be made. From what she'd seen so far, the department faced challenges similar to those she'd tackled elsewhere: strained relationships with minority communities, inconsistent accountability measures, and morale issues among officers. But every department was different, and Michelle knew she'd need to tread carefully. As she drove to the precinct the next morning, Michelle allowed herself a moment to reflect. This wasn't her first rodeo, but each new assignment came with its own unique hurdles. In her previous roles, she'd earned respect, not by shouting orders, but by listening, observing, and leading by example. She hoped Brookfield would respond similarly, though she wasn't naive enough to expect smooth sailing. When Michelle walked into the precinct, all eyes turned toward her. Conversations paused mid-sentence and officers straightened instinctively, unsure of what to make of the poised woman standing before them. She introduced herself briefly to the desk sergeant, who directed her to a temporary office set up for her use. Along the way, she nodded politely to those she passed, offering small smiles that few returned. Inside her office, Michelle took a deep breath, surveying the cramped space. A single window let in weak morning light, and the desk was cluttered with papers left behind by the previous occupant. It wasn't ideal, but it would do. She rolled up her sleeves, both literally and figuratively, and got to work. Her first order of business was meeting key staff members. One by one, captains, lieutenants, and senior officers filed into her office, introducing themselves and sharing their thoughts on the department's strengths and weaknesses. Most were respectful, though some barely concealed their skepticism. When Michelle mentioned plans to prioritize transparency and rebuild trust with the community, a few exchanged dubious looks. Among those who visited her office was Lieutenant Greg Monroe, a grizzled veteran with decades of experience under his belt. He spoke candidly about the challenges facing Brookfield PD, acknowledging both internal and external pressures. "Some folks around here won't take kindly to change," he warned, leaning forward in his chair. "But if anyone can turn things around, it's someone like you." Michelle appreciated his honesty, even if it came with a hint of caution. "Change isn't easy," she replied, holding his gaze. "But it's necessary. And I'm not asking anyone to agree with me right away. All I'm asking is that people keep an open mind." By late afternoon, word of Michelle's demeanor had begun to circulate. Officers who met her described her as intelligent, composed, and determined. Even the most resistant among them couldn't deny her professionalism. Still, whispers of doubt lingered in corners of the precinct. Some wondered how long she'd last in a place like Brookfield, while others speculated about whether she'd crack under pressure. Daniel, meanwhile, avoided crossing paths with her entirely. He stayed glued to his desk, pretending to focus on paperwork while secretly stewing over her presence. Every time someone mentioned her name, his jaw tightened a little more. He told himself it didn't matter. She'd be gone soon enough, just like all the other reformers who came and went without making a real difference. But deep down, he couldn't shake the memory of their encounter in the park. Something about the way she'd looked at him, as if seeing straight through his bluster, had unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite explain. As the day drew to a close, Michelle stepped out of her office to observe the bustling activity around her. Phones rang, keyboards clicked, and officers moved briskly between tasks. Despite the tension simmering beneath the surface, there was a sense of purpose in the air. These men and women were dedicated to their jobs, even if they sometimes struggled to see eye to eye with the people they served. Michelle reminded herself why she'd taken this position in the first place. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but with patience and persistence, progress was possible. As she locked up her office and headed for the parking lot, she allowed herself a small smile. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and perhaps new opportunities to prove that she belonged here. Whether everyone liked it or not, she was ready to lead. The morning of Michelle Carter's official introduction to the department arrived with a mix of anticipation and tension. Officers filed into the briefing room, some curious, others reluctant, but all aware that this meeting would set the tone for her leadership. The room buzzed with quiet murmurs as they took their seats, glancing toward the front where an empty podium stood waiting. Daniel Hayes sat near the back, arms crossed tightly over his chest. His usual scowl was deeper than ever, his jaw clenched so hard it might crack. He had no intention of showing any respect to the new chief, not after everything he'd said about her behind closed doors. To him, this whole situation felt like a slap in the face. How could someone from outside Brookfield possibly understand what it meant to be a cop here? And worse, how could someone like her, the same woman he'd confronted in the park just days ago, be trusted to lead? When Michelle walked into the room, the chatter died down almost instantly. She moved with purpose, her step steady and confident. Her navy blue blazer framed her figure perfectly, and her posture radiated authority without being overbearing. She carried a folder under one arm and a calm expression on her face. As she stepped up to the podium, She scanned the room slowly, making brief eye contact with several officers before speaking. "Good morning," she began, her voice clear and measured. "I want to start by thanking each of you for taking the time to be here today. I know how busy your schedules can get, and I appreciate the effort." Her opening words were met with silence. No applause, no nods of approval, just wary stares from most of the room. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding her gaze entirely. He didn't want to give her the satisfaction of acknowledging her presence, let alone her authority. "For those who don't know me yet, my name is Michelle Carter, and I'm honored to serve as your new chief of police." She paused briefly, allowing her statement to sink in. "I've spent much of my career working to strengthen relationships between law enforcement and the communities we serve. It's not always easy work, but it's necessary if we're going to build trust and make meaningful progress." As she spoke, her tone remained firm yet approachable. She outlined her vision for the department: improving accountability, fostering better communication with residents, and ensuring fairness in every decision made. Each point was delivered with precision, leaving no room for misinterpretation. But beneath her professionalism lay an unspoken challenge, a call for everyone in the room to rise to the occasion. Then came the moment Daniel had been dreading. Midway through her speech, Michelle glanced directly at him. Her eyes locked onto his for just a second, but it felt like an eternity. "I know there may be concerns about change," she continued, addressing the room at large but clearly speaking to him in particular. "And I understand that not everyone will agree with my methods right away. That's okay. What matters is that we move forward together, with integrity, respect, and a shared commitment to doing what's right." The weight of her words hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. For a split second, he thought she might call him out in front of everyone, exposing their encounter in the park. But she didn't. Instead, she returned to her broader message, wrapping up her remarks with a reminder that teamwork would be key to success. When the meeting ended, officers filed out of the room in groups, discussing what they'd heard. Some seemed cautiously optimistic, while others grumbled under their breath. Daniel stayed seated until nearly everyone else had left, his mind racing with conflicting emotions. Part of him wanted to storm out and vent his frustrations, but another part, the smaller, quieter part, felt a flicker of guilt. He couldn't deny that Michelle had handled herself well. Too well, in fact. Later that afternoon, Michelle asked to speak with Daniel privately. When he received the message, his stomach churned with unease. He considered refusing, but ignoring a direct request from the chief wasn't exactly a smart career move. Reluctantly, he made his way to her office, knocking on the doorframe before stepping inside. "Come in, Officer Hayes," Michelle said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. Her tone was neutral, neither warm nor hostile. Daniel hesitated for a moment before sitting down, his hands resting stiffly on his knees. "I assume you know why I wanted to talk to you," Michelle began, leaning slightly forward. Her expression was unreadable, giving nothing away. Daniel shrugged, feigning nonchalance. "Not really, Chief. You'll have to enlighten me." Michelle sighed softly, folding her hands on the desk. "Let's not play games, Officer Hayes. We've met before, in the park, late at night. Do you remember?" For a moment, Daniel froze. His throat went dry and his heart pounded in his ears. Of course he remembered. How could he forget? But hearing her bring it up now in this setting made it feel even more real, and far more damning. I wasn't sure it was you," he stammered, his usual bravado crumbling under her steady gaze. "It was dark and—" "It's all right," Michelle interrupted gently. "You don't need to explain yourself to me. What happened that night isn't the reason I called you. In here." Daniel blinked, caught off guard by her response. He'd expected anger, accusations, maybe even threats of disciplinary action. But instead, she sounded almost understanding. "The reason I wanted to speak with you," she continued, "is because I believe people deserve second chances, including you." His brow furrowed in confusion. "Second chances for what?" For proving that you're capable of growth, Michelle replied simply. I saw something in you that night, Officer Hayes. Potential. But potential means nothing, unless it's nurtured. So here's my offer. I won't hold what happened against you, provided you're willing to reflect on your actions and strive to do better moving forward. Daniel opened his mouth to protest, to argue that he hadn't done anything wrong, but the words caught in his throat. Something in Michelle's demeanor disarmed him, forcing him to confront the truth he'd been avoiding. Deep down, he knew she was right. His behavior that night had been fueled by prejudice, plain and simple. Admitting it aloud, however, was another matter entirely. I'm not saying this will be easy, Michelle added, breaking the silence. Change never is, but if you're serious about being a good officer, then it starts with honesty, with yourself and with others. Daniel stared at her, unsure of how to respond. For once in his life, he found himself at a loss for words. The anger he'd carried into the room had faded, replaced by a strange mix of shame and defiance. He didn't trust her. Not completely, but he also couldn't deny the sincerity in her voice. Finally, he nodded curtly. Understood, Chief. Michelle smiled faintly, though her expression remained serious. Good. I look forward to seeing what you're capable of, Officer Hayes. With that, the meeting ended. Daniel stood up abruptly, eager to put distance between himself and Michelle. As he walked back to his desk, his mind raced with conflicting thoughts. On one hand, he resented her for calling him out, even indirectly. On the other, he couldn't shake the feeling that she'd given him an opportunity to prove himself, whether he deserved it or not. Over the next few days, Michelle wasted no time putting her plans into motion. She introduced new training programs, focused on de-escalation techniques and cultural sensitivity. She held meetings with community leaders, listening intently to their concerns and promising to address them head-on. Slowly but surely, her presence began to reshape the culture of the precinct. Some officers embraced these changes willingly, recognizing the value in building stronger ties with the public. Others resisted, clinging to old habits and attitudes. Daniel fell somewhere in the middle. While he still harbored doubts about Michelle's leadership, he couldn't deny the impact she was having. Complaints from residents dropped noticeably, and morale within the department showed signs of improvement. Despite his lingering resentment, Daniel found himself watching Michelle closely, trying to understand what made her tick. Every decision she made seemed calculated yet compassionate, balancing firmness with empathy in ways he'd rarely seen before. It frustrated him to admit it, even silently. But she was proving to be exactly the kind of leader Brookfield PD needed. One evening, as Daniel sat at his desk reviewing case files, he glanced up to see Michelle walking past. Their eyes met briefly, and for the first time he didn't look away. There was no malice in her gaze, only quiet resolve. Whether she realized it or not, she had planted a seed of doubt in his mind, a question he couldn't ignore. Could he really continue down the same path he'd always walked, or was it time to try something different? For now, the answer remained unclear. But deep down, Daniel knew one thing for certain. Michelle Carter wasn't going anywhere. And neither was the challenge she represented. Weeks turned into months, and Michelle Carter's influence on Brookfield PD became impossible to ignore. The changes she implemented weren't drastic overnight transformations, but they were steady and consistent. New policies required officers to document every interaction with the public in detail, ensuring transparency and accountability. Community meetings were held regularly, giving residents a platform to voice their concerns directly to the department. Slowly, trust began to rebuild, brick by brick, but not everyone was happy about it. Daniel Hayes remained one of Michelle's most vocal critics, though his complaints were now whispered rather than shouted. He still rolled his eyes during training sessions and muttered under his breath when new procedures slowed down investigations. To him, Michelle's reforms felt like unnecessary hurdles, obstacles that got in the way of real policing. Yet, despite his grumbling, he couldn't deny the results. Crime rates were dropping and fewer complaints came in from the community. Even some of his colleagues who had initially resisted her ideas started to admit, grudgingly, that things were improving. Still, Daniel's pride wouldn't let him concede defeat. Instead, he doubled down on his defiance, determined to prove that Michelle's approach wouldn't work in the long run. His behavior grew increasingly reckless as he pushed boundaries, testing just how far he could go without crossing a line. And then, one fateful night, he went too far. It started with a routine traffic stop. Daniel pulled over a young man driving an older model sedan for speeding. At first glance, the situation seemed straightforward. Issue a ticket and move on. But when Daniel approached the car, his demeanor shifted. The driver, a black teenager named Jamal, looked nervous, a fact Daniel interpreted as suspicious rather than understandable given the circumstances. "License and registration," Daniel barked, shining his flashlight into the vehicle. Jamal fumbled with his wallet, hands shaking slightly as he handed over the requested documents. "What's the rush?" Daniel sneered, leaning closer to the window. "Got somewhere important to be?" Jamal swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "No, sir, just heading home." Daniel didn't believe him. Something about the kid's nervousness set off alarms in his head, alarms rooted more in bias than logic. Without cause, he ordered Jamal out of the car and began searching the vehicle. When Jamal protested, saying he hadn't done anything wrong, Daniel's temper flared. "Don't tell me what you did or didn't do," Daniel snapped, shoving Jamal against the hood of the car. "You're not in charge here, I am." The encounter escalated quickly. Passers-by stopped to watch, filming the scene on their phones. By the time backup arrived, Jamal was in handcuffs and Daniel was red-faced, shouting accusations about resisting arrest. The crowd murmured angrily, and videos of the incident spread online within hours. When Michelle heard about what happened, she immediately launched an internal investigation. She reviewed body camera footage, interviewed witnesses, and spoke with both Daniel and Jamal. What she saw confirmed her worst fears. Daniel had acted out of line, letting his biases dictate his actions. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened in Brookfield PD, but Michelle was determined to make sure it wouldn't happen again, not on her watch. The next morning, Michelle called Daniel into her office. Her expression was calm but firm as she motioned for him to sit. For once, Daniel didn't argue or try to defend himself preemptively. He knew he was in trouble, and there was no point denying it. "Officer Hayes," Michelle began, placing a file folder on her desk. "I've reviewed the evidence from last night's incident. I won't sugarcoat it. Your conduct was unacceptable." Daniel stared at the floor, his jaw clenched tightly. He wanted to lash out, to accuse her of being unfair or biased against him, but deep down he knew she was right. There was no justification for how he'd treated Jamal. "I understand emotions can run high in these situations," Michelle continued, her tone measured. "But we have a responsibility to uphold the law fairly and respectfully. What you did last night violated that trust." Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Chief, She held up a hand, cutting him off. "Let me finish. This isn't just about punishing you, it's about learning from mistakes. You're a good officer, Daniel. Or at least you have the potential to be. But potential means nothing unless you act on it." Her words hit him harder than any reprimand could. For years, Daniel had convinced himself that he was untouchable, that his experience and seniority gave him a free pass to do things his way. Now, sitting across from Michelle, he realized how hollow that belief truly was. "I'm suspending you for 2 weeks without pay," Michelle said finally. "During that time, I expect you to reflect on your actions and consider how they impact not only the people we serve, but also the reputation of this department. When you return, we'll discuss additional training and steps to ensure this doesn't happen again." Daniel nodded stiffly, unable to meet her gaze. Part of him wanted to fight back, to argue that she was singling him out because of their history. But another part, the part that had been quietly growing since their private conversation months earlier, knew she was giving him a chance to redeem himself. Whether he took it or not was entirely up to him. In the days following Daniel's suspension, rumors swirled through the precinct. Some officers sided with him, claiming Michelle was too harsh and that the punishment didn't fit the crime. Others supported her decision, arguing that holding Daniel accountable sent a clear message: no one was above the rules. Meanwhile, Michelle worked tirelessly to address the fallout from the incident. She met with Jamal and his family, apologizing personally for what had happened and promising to take steps to prevent similar occurrences in the future. She also organized a town hall meeting, inviting residents to share their thoughts and concerns about police conduct in Brookfield. The turnout was larger than expected, with dozens of people lining up to speak. At the meeting, voices ranged from angry to hopeful. Some demanded immediate firings and sweeping reforms, while others expressed cautious optimism that real change might finally be possible. Through it all, Michelle listened intently, taking notes and responding thoughtfully to each comment. When the evening ended, many attendees left feeling heard, even if they remained skeptical about whether lasting progress would follow. Back at the precinct, Michelle faced challenges of her own. Several senior officers questioned her handling of the situation, accusing her of favoritism toward certain groups. Lieutenant Greg Monroe, however, stood firmly by her side. Change is never easy, he reminded his peers. But if we don't hold ourselves accountable, who will? As the weeks passed, Michelle's reforms continued to gain traction. Officers attended mandatory training sessions on implicit bias and de-escalation techniques. Body cameras became standard equipment, and data collected from them was analyzed regularly to identify patterns of misconduct. Community outreach programs expanded, bringing officers face-to-face with residents in non-confrontational settings. Even Daniel noticed a shift, not just in the department, but in himself. During his suspension, he spent hours replaying the events of that night in his mind, dissecting every decision he'd made and questioning why he'd acted the way he did. It wasn't easy to confront his own flaws, but for the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel vulnerable. He reached out to a former colleague turned counselor, seeking guidance on managing his anger and biases. Slowly, painfully, he began to unpack the prejudices he'd carried for so long. When Daniel returned to work, Michelle greeted him with a mix of caution and hope. She assigned him to partner with Officer Ryan Peterson, hoping Ryan's positive attitude might rub off on him. At first, Daniel bristled at the arrangement, resenting the implication that he needed babysitting. But over time, he found himself opening up to Ryan in ways he never had before. They talked about difficult calls, shared frustrations, and even laughed occasionally, something Daniel hadn't done much of lately. One evening, after a particularly tense shift, Ryan turned to Daniel as they drove back to the precinct. "No, Chief Carter's not out to get you," he said casually. "She's just trying to help us all do better." Daniel sighed, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "I know," he admitted reluctantly. "It's just hard. Changing the way you think, the way you react. It's not something you can fix overnight." Ryan nodded sympathetically. "No kidding. But hey, at least you're trying. That's more than a lot of people would do." For the first time in months, Daniel felt a flicker of pride. Not the arrogant kind he used to wear like armor, but a quieter, humbler sense of accomplishment. He still had a long way to go, but for the first time, he believed he might actually get there. By the end of Michelle's 6th month as chief, Brookfield PD was unrecognizable from the fractured, distrustful department she'd inherited. Complaints against officers plummeted, and surveys showed rising approval ratings among residents. Community members began approaching officers with gratitude instead of fear. Even Daniel, though still rough around the edges, earned praise for his improved demeanor and willingness to listen. Michelle watched it all unfold with quiet satisfaction. She knew the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, but she also knew that true change required patience and perseverance. As she stood outside the precinct one evening, watching officers interact, Daniel Hayes sat alone in his apartment, staring at the cracked plaster ceiling above him. The room was dimly lit by a single lamp on the side table, its faint glow casting long shadows across the worn carpet. It had been months since Michelle Carter walked into Brookfield PD and turned everything upside down, but Daniel still struggled to make sense of it all. Some days, he felt like he was drowning, caught between the person he used to be and the person he was trying to become. Other days, he wondered if change was even possible for someone like him. His suspension had ended weeks ago, but its effects lingered. Every time he put on his uniform, he couldn't help but think about the weight of responsibility that came with it. For years, he'd worn the badge as a shield, a symbol of authority and power. Now it felt more like a mirror, reflecting back every flaw and mistake he'd tried so hard to ignore. He hated it. But deep down, he knew it was necessary. That night sleep eluded him. His mind raced with memories of past encounters, faces he'd dismissed, voices he'd silenced, moments he wished he could take back. He thought about Jamal, the teenager whose life he'd almost ruined with his reckless actions. What if things had gone differently? What if Jamal had fought back? The questions haunted him, gnawing at the edges of his conscience until he couldn't bear it anymore. The next morning, Daniel arrived at the precinct earlier than usual. He didn't have a specific reason. It just felt like something he needed to do. As he walked through the doors, he spotted Michelle standing near the coffee machine, scrolling through papers on her clipboard. She looked up briefly, meeting his gaze with a neutral expression. "Morning, Officer Hayes," she said simply, her tone neither warm nor cold. "Chief," Daniel replied, nodding awkwardly. He hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" Michelle raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by his request. "Of course, my office is free." They stepped inside, closing the door behind them. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, unsure of where to begin. Michelle waited patiently, giving him space to gather his thoughts. "I wanted to say," Daniel started, his voice low and uneven, "I wanted to apologize for what happened with Jamal and for how I've acted since you got here." Michelle studied him carefully, her expression unreadable. "Go on." "I know I've been difficult," Daniel admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. "You've tried to help me, and I've pushed back every step of the way. I don't know why. I guess I didn't want to admit I was wrong. But now, I see things differently." Michelle nodded slowly, her eyes softening slightly. "Apologies aren't easy, Officer Hayes, especially when they come from someone like you." Daniel flinched at her words, but he didn't argue. He deserved whatever judgment she handed down. "I'm not saying I've fixed everything," he continued. "There's still a lot I need to work on, but I want to try. Really try." For a long moment, Michelle said nothing. Then she leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the desk. "Change isn't about perfection, Daniel. It's about effort. About showing up every day and choosing to do better, even when it's hard." Her words struck a chord deep within him. It was the same message she'd given him months earlier during their first private conversation, but this time, it resonated differently. Back then, he'd dismissed it as empty rhetoric. Now he understood it was a lifeline, one he desperately needed to hold on to. "Thank you," Daniel said quietly, his voice barely audible. "For not giving up on me." Michelle offered him a small smile, one that carried both encouragement and challenge. "Don't thank me yet. The real test is ahead of you." Over the following weeks, Daniel threw himself into his work with renewed determination. He attended every training session Michelle scheduled, taking notes and asking questions he never would have considered before. During patrols, he made a conscious effort to listen more and assume less, treating each interaction as an opportunity to build trust rather than enforce authority. It wasn't easy. In fact, it was exhausting, but the results spoke for themselves. Residents who once avoided eye contact with him began nodding or even smiling as he passed by. Colleagues noticed the shift too, offering cautious praise for his improved attitude. One afternoon, while responding to a noise complaint at a local park, Daniel encountered a group of teenagers playing basketball. They eyed him warily as he approached, expecting trouble. Instead, Daniel stopped a few feet away and crossed his arms casually. "You guys causing problems?" he asked, his tone lighter than usual. One of the boys shrugged. Just shooting. Hoops officer. Daniel glanced at the makeshift court, its faded lines barely visible beneath layers of dirt and scuff marks. Mind if I join you? The teens exchanged puzzled looks, clearly unsure how to respond. Finally, one of them tossed him the ball. Sure. Why not? For the next 20 minutes, Daniel played alongside them, laughing and joking as they competed, in a friendly game of 2-on-2. By the time he left, the tension between them had melted away, replaced by mutual respect. As he climbed back into his patrol car, he realized something important. Connecting with people didn't mean losing control. If anything, it strengthened it. Meanwhile, Michelle continued pushing for progress within the department. She introduced new initiatives aimed at fostering collaboration between officers and residents, including joint volunteer projects and mentorship programs for at-risk youth. She also implemented stricter accountability measures, ensuring that misconduct was addressed swiftly and fairly. While some resistance remained, particularly among senior staff, the overall mood at the precinct had shifted significantly. Officers who once doubted her leadership now praised her vision and dedication. Even Lieutenant Greg Monroe, initially skeptical of Michelle's reforms, found himself inspired by her unwavering commitment to justice. She's not just changing policies, he told Ryan Peterson during lunch one day. She's changing hearts and minds. That's the kind of leader we've needed for years. Ryan nodded in agreement. And look at Hayes. Who would have thought he'd turn things around? Greg chuckled softly. People can surprise you. Sometimes. Even the ones you least expect. As winter gave way to spring, Brookfield began to feel different. Not perfect, but hopeful. Crime rates continued to decline, and community engagement soared. Residents who had once feared the police now viewed them as partners in keeping their neighborhood safe. At town hall meetings, applause replaced accusations and gratitude outweighed grievances. One evening, Michelle stood outside the precinct, watching as officers mingled with families during a neighborhood cookout. Children laughed as they played tag while adults chatted animatedly about recent improvements in the area. It was a scene she'd dreamed of when she first accepted the position, and seeing it come to life filled her with pride. Chief? A voice called out behind her. Michelle turned to see Daniel approaching, holding a plate of food. Officer Hayes, she greeted warmly. Enjoying yourself? He nodded, glancing around at the lively crowd. Yeah, it's nice. Seeing everyone together like this. It's a start, Michelle replied, her tone thoughtful. But there's still work to be done. Daniel smiled faintly, a hint of determination in his eyes. I know, and I'm ready for it. For the first time since they'd met, Michelle saw genuine sincerity in his expression. It wasn't just lip service. It was a promise to keep growing, learning, and doing better. And though challenges undoubtedly lay ahead, she believed he'd rise to meet them. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden hues over the gathering, Michelle felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. Change wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't quick. But in moments like these, surrounded by people working toward a common goal, it felt worth it. Worth every struggle, every setback, every ounce of effort poured into making Brookfield a better place for everyone. A year had passed since Michelle Carter first stepped into Brookfield PD, and the transformation was undeniable. The department that had once been riddled with tension and distrust now operated with a sense of purpose and unity. Crime rates were at their lowest in decades, and community relations had improved dramatically. Residents no longer flinched when they saw a police car driving by. Instead, they waved or nodded in acknowledgement. Officers, too, carried themselves differently, more open, more approachable, and more willing to listen. For Daniel Hayes, the past year had been a journey of growth he never thought possible. He still struggled sometimes, especially during tough calls or heated moments, but he was learning to manage his emotions and biases. His colleagues noticed the change, not just in his behavior, but in his attitude. He wasn't perfect, but he was trying. And for someone like Daniel, who had spent years resisting any form of self-reflection, that was a victory in itself. One crisp autumn morning, Michelle called everyone into the briefing room for an announcement. The officers filed in quietly, curious about what she wanted to say. Over the past year, they'd come to respect her leadership, knowing she didn't call meetings unless it was important. "Good morning," Michelle began, standing at the front of the room with her usual calm demeanor. "I want to start by thanking each of you for your hard work over the past 12 months. What we've accomplished together hasn't been easy, but it's been worth every effort." The room remained silent, all eyes fixed on her. Michelle paused briefly before continuing. "When I first arrived here, I knew we had challenges ahead of us, but I also believed in this department's potential, and in yours. You've proven me right time and time again." She scanned the room, making eye contact with several officers before landing on Daniel. Her gaze lingered for a moment, a small smile playing on her lips. Then she turned back to the group. "Today marks my 1-year anniversary as your chief, and while there's still much to do, I'm proud of how far we've come. Together, we've built stronger relationships with the community, held ourselves accountable, and shown that real change is possible." Applause broke out, soft at first but growing louder as officers clapped and cheered. Michelle raised a hand, signaling for quiet. "But our work isn't done yet. In fact, it's just beginning. To keep moving forward, I want to introduce a new initiative, a community outreach program led by officers who will serve as liaisons between the department and residents. These officers will focus on building trust, addressing concerns, and finding solutions collaboratively." The room buzzed with murmurs of approval. Michelle waited for the noise to settle before speaking again. "I've chosen Officer Hayes to lead this program." Daniel froze, his heart skipping a beat. He blinked rapidly, certain he'd misheard her. But when Michelle looked directly at him, her expression serious yet encouraging, he realized she meant it. "Officer Hayes has shown remarkable growth over the past year," she continued. "He's taken responsibility for his actions, embraced difficult conversations, and worked tirelessly to improve. I believe he's the right person for this role because he understands firsthand the importance of rebuilding trust." Daniel felt a wave of emotions crash over him: surprise, pride, fear. Could he really do this? Lead a program aimed at bridging gaps he'd once widened? He glanced around the room, meeting the eyes of his colleagues. Some nodded approvingly, others wore expressions of mild disbelief. But none of them seemed hostile. For the first time, Daniel felt truly accepted, not despite his flaws, but because he was working to overcome them. After the meeting ended, Michelle approached Daniel as he stood near the door, still processing everything she'd said. "You okay?" she asked gently. I don't know," Daniel admitted, running a hand through his hair. "Are you sure about this? About me?" Michelle smiled, her tone firm but kind. "I wouldn't have asked if I wasn't sure. You've earned this opportunity, Daniel. Now it's up to you to make the most of it." Leading the community outreach program wasn't easy. At first, Daniel doubted himself constantly, second-guessing every decision and worrying about failure. But Michelle checked in regularly, offering guidance without micromanaging. She reminded him that mistakes were part of the process, as long as he learned from them. The program started small, with monthly meetings at local libraries and community centers. Officers partnered with residents to discuss issues ranging from traffic safety to youth mentorship. Slowly, these conversations evolved into action plans. Crosswalks were installed in high-risk areas, after-school programs expanded, and neighborhood watch groups formed. Daniel found himself spending more time outside the precinct than in it. He visited schools, attended block parties, and even joined a local basketball league. Each interaction helped chip away at the barriers he'd once helped build. Residents began to see him not as an authority figure, but as a person, a neighbor who cared about their well-being. One evening, after a particularly successful meeting, Daniel sat on a park bench watching families stroll by. A young boy ran up to him, holding out a crumpled piece of paper. "Here," the child said excitedly. "It's for you." Daniel unfolded the paper to reveal a colorful drawing of a police officer shaking hands with a smiling kid. Scrawled across the top were the words, "Thank you." He looked up, grinning as the boy scampered back to his parents. In that moment, he realized something profound. The badge wasn't just a symbol of power, it was a bridge. And he finally understood how to use it. As the months passed, Michelle watched Daniel's progress with quiet satisfaction. She knew the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, for him or for the department. But she also knew they were heading in the right direction. Change wasn't linear. It ebbed and flowed, requiring constant effort and vigilance. But the foundation they'd built was strong enough to weather storms. On a cool spring afternoon, Michelle stood outside the precinct, observing officers interacting warmly with residents. Children laughed as they played nearby, and adults chatted casually about upcoming events. It was a scene that would have been unimaginable just 2 years earlier. Yet here it was, a testament to perseverance and belief in the possibility of better days. Daniel joined her, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "I thought you might need this," he said, handing her one. "Thanks," Michelle replied, taking a sip. "How's the program going?" "It's good," Daniel answered honestly. "People are starting to open up. They're sharing ideas, asking questions. It feels real." Michelle nodded, her expression thoughtful. "That's what happens when you show up consistently. Trust takes time, but it's worth the wait." They stood in companionable silence for a while, watching the world move around them. Finally, Daniel spoke again. "Chief, I never thanked you properly for believing in me when no one else did, including myself." Michelle smiled softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You did the hard work, Daniel. I just gave you the tools. Remember, leadership isn't about being perfect. It's about being present, even when it's hard." Daniel nodded, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. For so long, he'd defined himself by his failures. Now he was beginning to see himself differently, as someone capable of growth, redemption, and positive impact. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over Brookfield, Michelle turned to Daniel one last time. "We've come a long way," she said simply. "But the best part, we're just getting started.